Lillias Adie was arrested in 1704 when witch hunting in the rest of Europe had died down. 30 years later, it would be abolished in Scotland. There were moments in the 17th century when witch hunts were carried out on a mass scale, with hundreds arrested across the country, but individuals were accused and executed into the 18th century. The pattern of arrest and execution was the same whether part of a mass hunt or singular arrest. Cursing or quarrels, suspected healing, or associating with a reputed witch could result in accusation. The accused were summoned to the kirk session or church court, and evidence was collected against them. The accused would then be arrested, tortured, interrogated, and pricked for the devil's mark. During this inquisition, others could be named, and the process would begin again. A commission for a trial was required from the central government, and the evidence gathered through interrogation and witness statements would be used to petition for this. Many died in prison from neglect and torture while waiting for a trial, and others died by suicide. Only after a formal trial could the accused be legally executed. Accusation and arrest could be based on repute, or a bad reputation built up over the course of years of neighborly arguments and sexual reprimand by the Protestant Kirk. But a formal accusation could also happen suddenly, when one person, usually under torture, named another as an accomplice. If a reverend was inclined to seek out witches in his parish, rumor was enough to doom anyone. Lillias's accuser was a woman named Jean Bizet. Neighbors could come forward with accusations during a kirk session. In the session minutes, Jean Bizet describes going from house to house in the village one night drinking. Near the end of the evening, she was seized with terror, convinced that Lillias was coming for her. Other witnesses heard Jean Bizet cry out, "Oh, Lily with her blue doublet! Oh, Mary, Mary Wilson! Christ, keep me!" while wringing her hands and then passing out. According to the minutes, Jean Bizet was at a friend's house late into the evening and was in a state of drunken distemper. She accused Lillias Adie of acting with Janet White and Mary Wilson in a conspiracy. Lillias was perhaps vulnerable as an elderly single woman. The victims of the Scottish witch hunts were overwhelmingly poor, older women. Lillias had an unusual appearance that perhaps marked her out from her neighbors. We know from the dimensions of Lillias's coffin before it was destroyed that she was uncommonly tall. Her teeth were very prominent. Jean Bizet fixates on Lillias's blue doublet, and from the scant statements at the trial, it's impossible to know why this troubled Bizet. Was Lillias's doublet brighter or finer than most? While this detail is seemingly inconsequential, it forms a fragment of Lillias as an individual woman, part of a time, a place, and a people, and it helps us picture her. Following the accusations of Jean Bizet, Lillias Adie was arrested by Baillie Williamson at 10 p.m. on the 28th of July, 1704. Modern readers marvel at the confessions wrung from the accused during the witch hunts, perhaps imagining women on a witness stand confessing bizarre, sordid behavior. This is often the way witch trials are portrayed in fiction. The reality is that, after arrest, the church needed evidence to take to the Privy Council in Edinburgh. The bulk of the evidence was the confession, extracted over months, during which the accused was often tortured, starved, and sleep-deprived. There was no limit on how the kirk could hold someone before producing this evidence. The interrogators would often ask leading questions. When did you sleep with the devil? Where did you meet other witches? And, crucially, what are their names? These interrogations would have been intense, a room of powerful men questioning a terrified, tortured woman. During Lillias's initial interrogation, she swore, "What I am to say shall be as true as the sun in the firmament." She confessed to a blurry of demonic meetings. Between interrogations, she was possibly held in the garret of the townhouse of Kolhem, the seat of government and also a prison, where women accused as witches were confined and watched. The loft space where she was held had no fire for warmth, and what little light there was came up through the slats of the floor. A man would have been paid to watch her and keep her awake. Sleep deprivation was the most common form of torture used to extract confessions from the accused. It was effective. Lack of sleep for 1 or 2 nights created a docile suggestibility in the prisoner's mindset. Longer periods of sleep deprivation resulted in hallucinations and deeper confusion. Between Lillias's trial record and everything that went unsaid and unrecorded, we must read her sufferings. The interrogators only wrote down what they thought they needed to convict her. Perhaps she was led, in her exhaustion, to believe what was being asked of her. The crime of witchcraft carried merrymaking with the devil, renunciation of Christian baptism, and the sex crime of meeting with the devil carnally. The ministers pointedly asked accused women if they had had sex with Satan, and the churchmen wanted details. Lillias was interrogated by the minister and church elders 4 times during the course of her month-long incarceration, which ended only because she died, perhaps of suicide or the effects of imprisonment on her aged body. The trial record states that Lillias had been meeting with the devil since the previous witch hunt in Toryburn in 1666. She would have seen these earlier public executions as a young woman. Over the course of their lives, almost everyone in early modern Scotland would have witnessed the spectacle of women strangled and burned at the stake. It was an event, and often ale was given to the spectators. The bonfire would have been seen for miles, and the smoke would have lingered for days, a signal to other women. No one was safe. None were immune to accusation. This is how terror works. I put a spell on you.
Investigations of your all-time favorite president, me, is just a continuation of the most disgusting witch hunt in the history of our country.
Yeah, you better stop the things you do.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
Spell on you. Because you're mine. You're mine.
There's no such thing as a trans woman. There's no such thing as a trans person. There is no such thing. There are people that call themselves these things that may have other issues manifesting that then make them think they're this, but no, we have to.
I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you anyhow. And I don't care if you don't want me. I'm yours right now. Oh, you hear me? I put a spell on you. Trans. Disclaimer, I am not a jazz singer. I cannot sing like Nina Simone. And I'm also wearing these fat-ass acrylics, so listen, I did my best. Lillias Adie was not a witch. Her only crime was being the sort of woman Jean Bizet didn't like. Maybe she was too tall, too old, too poor, or too weird for Jean Bizet. We'll never know exactly why she was singled out, only that she was horrifically treated by her community and she died a horrible, nightmarish death. We need to talk about Lillias Adie. We need to talk about the witch mythos. I recently devoured Ashes and Stones, a book written by the insanely talented Alison Shaw, a woman I'm very lucky to get to call a friend. In it, she takes the reader on a journey through the incredibly complex lives of women accused of witchcraft in mostly 17th and 18th century Scotland, interlacing these tales with her own journey and struggles as a woman. Ali and I became friends through a Patreon initiative which pairs creators with other creators, and we realized that we were both immigrants from California with a lot in common. On one of our recent calls, we were exploring how the witch mythos has become very popular in a very specific demographic, a group of radical feminists, sometimes referred to as TERFs, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists. They see themselves as modern-day witches, women oppressed by misogynistic men. Now, Ali's book has nothing to do with transphobia, and Ali herself is a massive trans ally, and she's been a big supporter of myself in my own transition. But in the UK right now, it's almost impossible to separate the witch mythos from the modern-day transphobic movement. Transphobia and the witch mythos have become interlinked politically. The connection to the witch mythos and transphobic belief can be seen as originating with J.K. Rowling, a woman who wrote many books about witches and who is now a scion of the transphobic movement. Now, I'd like to talk about J.K. Rowling just about as little as possible in this video, because there are better content creators than I who have covered the sordid tale of Joanne in excellent detail. But J.K. Rowling is more of an amplifier of transphobic ideas than an originator. For that, we need to look to Angela Wilde, a self-proclaimed radical feminist who released merchandise with the slogan, "This witch doesn't burn," which J.K. Rowling herself purchased and promoted on her Twitter. The shirt's message is clear. Gender-critical women are modern-day oppressed women because of their beliefs, but they won't cow under pressure from men, read trans women. They won't burn. The implication here is a contradiction. Rowling and these other witches can't burn or can't be cancelled or stopped, and yet these women are simultaneously victims of trans rights activists. So either they can't be cancelled, or cancellation is a huge threat to them, one they viciously campaign against. Side note, but I found this hilarious. Angela Wilde is radical for other reasons too. She believes in spelling women with a Y, which I find amusing because aren't words supposed to matter and be sacred and unchangeable? And if they matter so much, shouldn't you learn how to read them?
Wild Woman Workshop is a lesbian-owned and female-centered radical feminist shop for fearless Amazons who are sick to be told to shut up and who like to wear their politics.
Anyway, let's explore this comparison between gender criticals and witches. The women in Ali's book are often older, impoverished, isolated women, some of whom are failing with conventional ideas of womanhood and are ostracized for it, such as Lillias Adie, who is a tall woman, a stereotypically masculine characteristic. Many of the women accused of witchcraft were accused by their fellow women, as in the case of Jean Bizet and Lillias Adie, sometimes for jealousy reasons, sometimes because of the knowledge they held in traditional pagan practices, such as a healer, sometimes for no reason at all. Witch hunts are often seen by many of us today as fringe events that took place by churches or random lynching mobs running around accusing random women. But the reality is that these were state-sanctioned events of violence by men against women. Men in power would imprison and torture these women into being forced to make outlandish confessions, and then they would hold sham court sessions where they would almost exclusively condemn these women to horrifying deaths. Comparing women accused of witchcraft and TERFs, we can point out that TERFs are often older women and that some of them are also queer themselves, both of which create experiences of ostracization, similar to women accused of witchcraft in medieval times. But apart from that, gender-critical women are by and large far wealthier and far more powerful than the trans women they accuse of being their bullies. When most of us picture a witch in our heads, we picture a cartoonish woman with a tall, pointy hat and a long, crooked nose, riding a broomstick and cackling off into the night. This is something all women, trans or cisgender, should be able to take issue with and maybe even disgust in. It's a misogynistic trope that we turn a blind eye to in media and wider culture. And it's not just misogynistic, of course, it's also ageist. As women age, they can begin to take on some masculine qualities, which can, for many cisgender women, be gender dysphoric. Many women will grow more facial bone throughout their lifetimes as they age, which can be similar to a masculine puberty. Their estrogen levels will drop as they age. They may have to deal with more unwanted hair growth and that sort of thing. Ultimately, dysphoria is a sensation brought upon by aging. Gender dysphoria isn't a trans experience, it's a human experience. But let's bring this back to witchcraft. The image of the witch is often an older, more masculine woman, but we can bring race into this too. When people think of crooked noses, they often think of Jewish stereotypes, like the goblins in J.K. Rowling's books. Or perhaps they may think of aquiline noses, noses that have a curve to them, which are often associated with non-Western races. There's also loads of history behind women being accused of witchcraft being Romani or being in some way perceived as or connected to the Romani people in medieval Europe. I'm gonna pause for a moment and confess something to you guys. I did the Lensa thing. I know it's problematic, but I was so fucking curious about it, so I did a set of Lensas through the non-binary category, a set through the female category, and a set after my facial feminization surgery. When I did my Lensa photos last year as non-binary, these were my results. Generally flattering images of more masculine or more feminine body people in about an equal quantity. When I did them as a female, I got very different results. This was before my FFS, so although I did present very femininely at the time, I had significantly masculine features on my face still. I had a prominent brow bone and a long, crooked nose. I couldn't help but feel in these results the image of the stereotypical witch staring back at me, an evil villain. Meanwhile, after FFS, my photos came across softer, more princessy. And AI art is bad, but it also is really fucking interesting what it tells us about biases and stereotypes in art and humanity at large. Ultimately, what it helped me see is that there's a great deal of similarity between the image of the witch and trans women. Similar to the modern witch mythos, we are seen as masculine women, often as ugly women by society. We are systematically persecuted. Mobs are formed to protest our existence. Extrajudicial killings are carried out. We are more likely to be societally ostracized, to be financially worse for wear. Like Lillias, we too may be taller than is usually expected for women, and we may be treated poorly because of it. There's a sect of transphobes called transvestigators, and these people will look at any image of a person and try to suss out whether they might secretly be hiding the fact that they're transgender. This mostly happens with cisgender women. They'll take photos of famous cisgender actresses and find the most absurd reasons to assume that these people were in fact born men. And it's absolutely absurd and definitely reminiscent of the attitudes of trying to scope out whether or not someone might potentially be a witch. Based on no evidence whatsoever, these women are hunted, accused, discriminated against. A number of my cisgender female friends have told me that they've had to battle with transphobia, that they've been accused of secretly being men, that they've been interrogated as to whether their womanhood is in fact real or genuine. Definitely sounds like a witch hunt to me, but maybe I just don't know what I'm talking about. The women accused of witchcraft in Ellie's book were also often women seen as promiscuous, with narratives being invented about their sexual lives with the devil and other men. Similarly, trans women are often forced to turn to sex work to survive in an incredibly hostile world, and we are viewed as promiscuous, sinful, and wrong for it. Sometimes this deviance alone is enough to justify some individual's hatred towards us. All that to say, there's infinitely more in common with the witch mythos and trans women than there is with the witch mythos and anti-trans women. And the fact that gender criticals fail to see this and compare themselves to the oppressed when they are themselves the oppressors is frustrating. I know they see themselves as symbols of feminine oppression by men, but they fail to see that the oppression these women experienced all those years ago is totally tangential to the oppression that trans people experience today. And they themselves would have been the women in power and privilege standing by watching their fellow women burn, or maybe reporting them for witchcraft themselves. There's a lot of parallel in the ways that anti-trans women carry the torch for the oppression of men and the state to carry out. They are the Jean Bizets of the modern age, telling men in power and the state to go after trans women because we pose a threat to them, because they don't like us, because we're too tall or too weird, or they don't like our blue doublets. What's wrong with our blue doublets, Jean? Jean Bizet didn't imprison or torture Lillias Adie, but her actions in singling out and ostracizing her led to her death at the hands of horrible men and the state. TERFs claim they want to protect women from patriarchy, to be free of the violence of men, and yet they are more than happy to offer up trans women as victims to this very same patriarchy, this very same violence of men. They're right when they wear t-shirts, "This witch won't burn." They won't burn. They're not being put up to the pyres. We're the ones who are burning. The conflation of gender-critical belief with historically oppressed women is a huge misinterpretation of history, but I think it's also insulting to the victims. And frankly, even comparing trans women to the women accused of witchcraft also makes me uncomfortable. These women were victims of some of the most significant atrocities against women committed in human history. They were gross, horrifying displays of state and male violence, and yet their image is being touted by people in favor of state violence who are themselves cruel and unkind to vulnerable people. But even in positive contexts, is it ever okay to embody the image of a group who fell victim to insane atrocities for the sake of political messaging? We are not these women. We are not being accused of witchcraft, and none of us are, neither trans nor TERF. We do not bear their accusations, their victimhood. Even while relating to experiences of societal ostracization, as a feminine person, I cannot possibly compare our lives to theirs. These women accused of witchcraft did burn, and they weren't witches. They were just innocent women who died in the worst possible ways. I don't understand why the way women were genocided in medieval times isn't treated with the same amount of respect as other similar events in history. Politicians now also love to compare themselves to witches, with Trump talking about the witch hunts haunting his political career. People searching for his legitimate crimes is compared to the insane oppression towards women in medieval times. I guess his comparison is because women weren't actually witches and Trump allegedly isn't actually a criminal. But he is an agent of state violence and oppression, and he would have been analogous to the horrible men in power who oppressed these women should he have been born all those years ago. King James VI and First was a big reason the witch hunts claimed as many victims as they did in the 17th and 18th century, due to his book entitled Demonology. He saw his war on witchcraft as a way to increase his power and legitimacy, strengthening his religious power at the expense of a genocide against women. Similarly, Trump and Rishi Sunak and other politicians are writing their own demonology books to paint trans women as dangerous predators, distracting from their shitty platforms with a huntable boogeyman, the trans community. Witches aren't just a fun Halloween costume, or a spooky amusement park ride, or a tourist dungeon in Edinburgh. The stories and lives of these women are some of the most intense, heartbreaking tales you will ever read. They deserve to be remembered. Okay, so I have to admit, I'm one of those people who really loves witchcraft, but doesn't actually totally believe in it. Like, I don't believe that I'm actually casting spells necessarily, or that I'm actually somebody who can access magical powers or abilities, and I mean no disrespect to people who do believe those things. I grew up in a very religious environment, so anything to do with spirituality is a complex space for me. That said, I think that ritual is such a powerful and important part of the human experience. I love the way that ritual helps you experience mindfulness, connect with your wider community, and all of these other things. And so ritual is something that I've been starting to explore and something that I think is really cool. So since we're honoring witchcraft in its history, the women accused of witchcraft, and specifically the trans community in the modern day, I thought it would be kind of fun to do a little ritual with you guys. So we're going to do a protection spell for the trans community. At the end of the day, whether or not I believe any of this is real, I think it's really nice to just send positive energy out into the world. Alright, protection spell time. Okay, so we have Angelica, we have barley, we have a black candle, we have a bottle. We don't need a lot. Oh my god. Just went everywhere. Alright. It's okay. My flatmate will clean this up later. Just kidding. Just kidding. I'll do it myself. As I hold this nail in hand, protection is what I command. And now we use the iron nail to etch symbols or sigils into our black candle to represent protection. I really want to try to do like the little gender, like the little trans symbol. Okay, it's not like phenomenally well done, but I will say it's recognizable. You can tell that this is the trans symbol, and I'm really happy with that. So this is for the entire trans community who have to put up with a lot of shit and everything that we have to deal with. And yeah, I love you guys. I'm grateful to be a part of this community. It's really special to me. And I hope that things get better for us and that we can live in a world that is safer for all of us, no matter how we identify or where we are in life or varying degrees of privilege or safety or lack thereof. I hope that we can all live happy, fulfilling, complex lives. That's what I want for us. Alright, I think it's pretty sealed up, so there we go. That's our protection spell. It's so sad reading all of this stuff about the Leopards Eating Faces party. I feel so bad for their victims, but I also feel bad for the people who voted for them, because how are they supposed to know that their faces were going to get eaten too, you know? And they're getting a lot of hate right now, which I understand, especially from people who have lost loved ones to the leopards, but I just think that there were good reasons, I'm sure, that they had to vote for that party, and they're people too, you know? I just think that we need to see things from both sides, that's all. I'm very intelligent. The queer people are a danger to society narrative is long and old and violent. Gay people will groom your kids, trans people threaten sacred gender norms, slippery slope logical fallacies that involve marrying dogs. These are all things we group under the concept of a moral panic. The idea that people in power can stoke up irrational disdain for groups and movements centered around usually fear of those groups in some way. Oh, you want to nationalize healthcare? But if we do that, it'll lead to communism. Коммунизм шагает по планете. What's that? You want to make gay marriage legal? Soon they'll be marrying your children to non-binary space aliens. Conservatives love slippery slope logical fallacies where you start at one conclusion, gay marriage becoming legal, and imply that that will lead to something utterly absurd and much more easily disapproved of, marrying your children to non-binary space aliens. In this tweet by the lovely Candace Owens, she uses the slippery slope logical fallacy to imply that Dylan Mulvaney identifying as a girl will lead to pedophilia, which is silly not only because it operates on a false premise that Dylan identifies as a little girl. She doesn't. She's an adult woman and identifies as one. But it's also silly because these two premises are completely disconnected. Of course, validating a trans woman's identity is not the same as condoning pedophilia. In these instances, conservatives are just being completely disingenuous and hoping their audiences are frankly stupid enough to fall for it. And this is what we call a bad faith actor. Bad faith actors aren't worth engaging with because they're not really debating anything real. They're just stoking up existing populist rage and moral panic. But there are good faith anti-trans actors too. There are anti-trans individuals who understand trans identity and still oppose it utterly, while still engaging with the realities of trans existence in more or less good faith. David Graeber writes in The Democracy Project that he prefers this brand of conservatives to liberals because at least these conservatives engage honestly with the position of leftists, or in this case, the trans community specifically.
If you are a radical, at least with conservatives you know where you stand. They are your enemies. If they wish to understand you, it is only to facilitate your being violently suppressed. This leads to a certain clarity. It also means they often honestly do wish to understand you.
They may be hateful humans campaigning against our rights, but at least they're open about that position and debating it honestly. What's more insidious to Graeber are the liberals, those who sit at the center of debate seeing merit from both sides and holding apologist stances for systems of injustice and cruelty to certain groups. A false equivalence logical fallacy is when an equivalence is drawn between two subjects based on flawed or false reasoning. Basically the apples to oranges thing. A common theme I see in the trans debate is a comparison between violence committed against trans people and the violent image of trans activists. Angela Wilde, who I spoke about in part 1 of the video, got a prominent Daily Mail news article written about her that reads, "Trans activists threaten to bomb my studio. Lesbian entrepreneur gets daily death and rape threats after J.K. Rowling plugged her feminist t-shirts on Twitter. But thanks author for sending her sales through the roof." When you scroll down the article, she shows examples of the messages that she's received. Now, if I received death threats, rape threats, and threats to bomb my studio, I probably would have included those as evidence, not random anonymous messages of someone saying, "We're coming for you," which very easily could be interpreted as just meaning we plan to fight back against your hateful vitriol on a political level. Someone messaging you drop dead or messages wanting you dead is not a death threat. It's a mean message. There's a difference between "I'm going to kill you" and "I think the planet would be better off without you on it." Then we get to the bomb threat, where someone is wishing someone bombed her studio. This is just not a bomb threat. It's once again a mean message from someone who's probably 10 years old in a basement. So yes, Angela receives abuse, but the article flat out lies about the nature of the abuse, making it seem far more violent than it is. Meanwhile, just the other week, 2 trans women were the victims of an arson attack in East London. A trans girl was stabbed to death in the UK recently by her fellow students. In 2022, 38 trans people were shot and killed. Trans people face enormous discrimination in the workplace and insane levels of street harassment. That's just in real life, in-person shit. Online, 98% of trans people have faced cyberbullying, which includes death and rape threats that we don't even need to make up or hyperbolize. Someone may have wanted someone to bomb Angela's studio, but for the trans victims of this recent arson attack, which was confirmed to be motivated by transphobia, this violence is real. It's not imagined. It's not just some 12-year-old troll in a Facebook message. In the same widely read Daily Mail article, Angela also mentions that her sales have skyrocketed, which is strange for someone who's being violently oppressed by the trans. Pitting oppression faced by trans people against mean tweets and anonymous Facebook messages that TERFs receive is a false equivalence. I genuinely believe that some of the things tweeted and messaged of anti-trans people is downright not okay stuff, Death threats and misogynistic themes levied against horrible people is, in my opinion, still horrible, but it is by no means comparable to the oppression that trans people actually face, and it doesn't make you, as an oppressor of a minority, yourself oppressed. But a lot of people don't see it that way. In ContraPoint's recent video, she highlights the fact that, for many of these anti-trans individuals, trans people aren't capable of experiencing oppression at all, because they don't view trans oppression as real, or even trans people as real. Yes, really. Seeing us get murdered, beat up, kicked out of our jobs, or having our houses burned down isn't oppression if you think that's a legitimate response by society towards gender nonconformity. In the Democracy Project, Graeber highlights the ways in which middle-class liberals and the media manage to paint activists as the violent bullies to distract from the causes they're fighting for. When the police smashed through a shop window with a protester's head during the Occupy Wall Street movement, it didn't make the press. But when 2 windows were shattered by protesters, harming absolutely no one, the entire movement was labeled as violent. This carefully calculated media campaign against the protesters was then used to justify increased violence by the police against the protesters. The police weren't the violent ones for engaging in extremely physically violent and sexually violent practices against the protesters. The police were just doing their jobs because the protesters were the violent ones who were instigating all of this violence, even though they didn't actually hurt anyone. But the police needed to step in and beat these protesters into the ground and sexually harass them. They had to. They were forced, you guys. Similarly, with the Black Lives Matter movement in more recent times, the protesters defending racial freedom were compared as equally violent as the police.
Before long, liberal commentators had formed a consensus that the real problem with Occupy was not any active, actual physical violence that had taken place. These had pretty much all been carried out by police. But the fact that some occupations contained some elements that, while they had not committed any acts of violence, felt that acts of damage to property could be justified.
This both sides positioning serves to prop up a regime of actual violence against oppressed groups who are seeking more democratic or human rights-based freedoms. In many cases, groups which are non-violent but have an image of violence carefully constructed around them by the media. This is definitely happening with trans rights activists who are painted as violent for anonymous messages online, tweets, and the odd things shouted at a protest, even though those that they're fighting against are actually physically violent against trans people in a far more measurable way. To quote another esteemed philosopher, James Acaster,
"Can't go around treating everyone the same before you've got equality. What, you go past a school, see a bully, punch another kid in the face, then get out your car, go up to the bully? You make me sick, and just for balance, you're a piece of shit as well." That was even-handed. I'm a good person. I treat everyone the same.
The fact of the matter is that while certain groups of people aren't treated as equal, it's not fair to say that we should all be equally pacifist. Even Gandhi stated that violence to combat injustice was morally superior than doing nothing to combat injustice at all. The unfair positioning of the trans community is that even if one of us were to do something vaguely bad, that statistic would be weighted far heavier than the countless similar grievances on the other side, or even more likely worse grievances. The position of the oppressed is that we have to prove absolute purity at all times, and that isn't possible or fair. Speaking of statistics, those have a big impact on this whole thing as well. The vast majority of trans people aren't even on Twitter, and they're not on the streets campaigning for trans equality. The ones that are, of course, are the ones that are in the gaze of the right-wing firing squad. They may not have asked for this, but their tweets and slogans and protests are the only thing the right-wing have to base their entire anti-trans positioning on. They can't very well use their passing trans dentist as fuel, who they don't even know is trans, or all of the trans people living perfectly normal, quiet lives away from press and pickets and Twitter threads. Similarly, those who detransition, approximately 1% or less of all trans people, are constantly touted as holistically representative of the entire trans experience. Headlines that talk about ex-trans converts who were miserable with their transition is infinitely more likely to get clicks than an article about the vast majority of trans people who are happy. So less than 1% becomes indicative of the whole. Similarly insidious is the way people like Joanne manipulate other, more dark statistics. Joanne tweeted out that there are more trans women sex offenders in prison than cis men, to further fuel the horrible transphobic notion that trans women are all perverts and predators. But this is just statistical manipulation. Did you know that 100% of people in prisons have been convicted or accused of a crime? If there's 2 trans women in jail and 100 cis men, and one of those trans women is a sex offender, then you can say that 50% of all trans women in jail are sex offenders. It's ridiculous and silly to use statistics like this in a group of people who are already statistically more likely to be sex offenders simply because they're literally in prison. But of course, that's exactly what poor old witch who won't burn Joanne does. Statistics can be incredibly useful at communicating truths to us, but they can also be so easily manipulated and cherry-picked. Another thing I've observed is that even when statistics are on the side of the trans community, they can still be just flat out ignored or not believed by people. In speaking with a transphobic family member, I brought up the statistics on how minimal detransition actually is, and she responded by saying that she doesn't believe that statistic because detransitioners are being silenced into not talking about how much they hated being trans. So actually the numbers of detransitioners have to be much higher because she personally thinks that they are. Like, we literally have cold hard evidence that very few people detransition, and when they do, it's overwhelmingly because of external pressures. But sure, let's just ignore that evidence because it's in favor of a positive position on trans people, and we can't have that. Sometimes facts and statistics and scientific evidence are just useless in the face of willful ignorance.
I have this theory that transphobia is a kind of organized, deliberate ignorance. I think that we often talk about like, oh, people are just ignorant. They feel what they don't understand. And I'm like, okay, yes, but some people also refuse to understand. And I think transphobia can be understood as an organized, deliberate ignorance. And I think that it's a refusal to look at the facts of biology, like about other people like, oh, there's like only 2 sexes, XX and XY. And every scientist and biologist in the world would be like, no, it's not. No, it's not. Absolutely, it's more complex than that. Sex is a cluster of properties. You can absolutely change them, or like change a lot of them. I myself have changed sex. Like, believe me, you can do it. But then people will go, no, you just can't do that. I refuse to look at these facts. That's not true. What I was told in high school is the case. And then you'll have people who go, oh, like self-ID is a threat to women. It's like, okay, well, here are the stats from like the dozens of countries that have already adopted self-ID. There's no proven threat to women at all. There's no evidence for this position at all. People go, no, refuse to look at that, won't do it. Something that I often see transphobic people do on social media is you'll like try and explain what sex is to them, or you try and say, oh, here's the stats, or whatever, and they'll just say, word salad. And that's their reply. It's just like, I refuse to understand this. I won't look at it. And it's like, you can't really argue with people whose whole position is the denial of reality.
There are so many ways that people can justify the maltreatment of minorities, or ways in which they can empathize with the position of the oppressor. After Ashes and Stones was published, Ali's book landed a review in The Scotsman by a certain Alan Massey.
What is missing from this book is any understanding of pre-Enlightenment Christianity. For sure, the ministers who zealously persecuted supposed witches are merely brutal, misogynist men. Fair enough, perhaps, but they believed in the devil as a physical reality, the father of lies, the spirit of evil, the enemy of God, capable of assuming human shape. Martin Luther, accosted by him in his study, threw an inkwell at him. The Bible was the word of God, therefore literally true, and Presbyterian Scots were steeped in it. Anyone practicing witchcraft was an agent of the devil, and the Bible was quite clear, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Belief in witchcraft and demonic possession was general. James VI, a highly intelligent man, believed he had been endangered by men and women trafficking with the devil and wrote a book on demonology. Later in life, he concluded that much of that past for witchcraft was mere fantasy.
In his review, he belittles Alison's feminist lens, stating that she lacked sympathy for the historical context of the witch trials, that she should have sympathy for the men who murdered women willy-nilly because they genuinely thought they were fighting a holy war against the devil, and they were just doing as they were told in the Bible. Obviously, she just doesn't understand how difficult it was for these men murdering all these women. Think of the men! It's mind-boggling to me that anyone can find a way to empathize with the cold-blooded murderers of these women accused of witchcraft. And yet, miraculously, Alan finds a way. Like, this review is just the epitome of patronizing, mansplaining, violence apologist bullshit. When we find ways to justify the oppression of a group of people, we enable that oppression to be ongoing. There are some things that we as a society should agree upon are bad and without justification. And unless you're Alan fucking Massey, the genocide of any subset of the human population should be amongst your values on the side of bad. It's really nice and cozy and comfy to say that all sides are valid and we should just be nice and loving to everyone no matter what. But that's not the world we're living in. Tolerant centrism favors the oppressor, and so it is, to a degree, oppression. Liberal tears taste so good. So, think critically about the ways in which the right wing co-opts images of victimhood to enable further oppression of vulnerable people. Thank you for watching. Make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. And this video would not have been possible without my incredible, insanely gorgeous, magical, delightful Patreons. If you want to help enable me to create more content like this, there will be a link down below. And with that, I have places to be, things to do, so time to turn this baby off. Ugh.